Imagine, for a second, two countries that share a border that was never actually drawn. A line that was more of a suggestion on paper than a reality on the ground. A ghost, really, left behind by a colonial power. Well, this isn't some fictional story. This was the massive challenge facing Burkina Faso and Mali, a problem so big it took them to the International Court of Justice. So let's dive into this incredible case of how you draw a line in the sand when there's nothing there.
And that's really the central puzzle, isn't it? What happens when two brand new nations inherit a border that's vague, that's been shifting around for decades? How does international law even begin to step in to create certainty where there's only been confusion and, to stop a potential conflict before it starts?
So here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the colonial history that created this ghost border in the first place. Then we'll look at the one crucial legal principle the court relied on. We'll dig into the messy, conflicting evidence they had to sort through, see how they actually drew the final line, and wrap up with why these old colonial lines still matter so much today.
All right, to really get this, we've got to wind the clock way back. See, both Burkina Faso and Mali used to be part of this huge territory called French West Africa. For them, the lines between their territories weren't serious international frontiers. They were just internal administrative lines that the French colonial government would change over and over again, whenever it suited them.
This timeline right here, this is the source of the entire problem. It's kind of wild. In 1919, France creates a new colony, Upper Volta. Then just 13 years later in 1932, poof, it's gone, wiped off the map and its land divided up. But wait, in 1947 they bring it back with this one critical instruction. Its borders are whatever they were back in 1932. So when both countries finally got their independence in 1960, this hazy, almost forgotten administrative line was all they had.
So, with a history that messy, how could a court possibly find a clear answer? I mean, where do you even start? Well, they turned to one of the most fundamental principles in all of international law, a rule that was basically tailor-made for situations just like this one.
It's called uti possideris juris. Yeah, it's a mouthful of Latin, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. Think of it like this. You inherit a big piece of property. The rule says, essentially, as you possess, so you may possess. The fence line you had the moment you inherited the land, that's your new permanent boundary. The goal is to take those often random colonial lines and just freeze them in place, transforming them into stable international borders.
And the court's judgment tells us exactly why this principle is so incredibly important. The whole point, they said, is to prevent newly independent states from falling into fratricidal struggles. Basically, to stop brothers from fighting brothers over territory. It's all about choosing stability and peace, even if the lines themselves aren't perfect.
Okay, so having the rule is one thing, but actually figuring out where that 1932 line was, that was the real detective work. The judges were staring at this mountain of conflicting clues, old colonial laws, maps that didn't agree with each other, and stories about how things actually worked on the ground.
So the first thing the court had to do was create a pecking order for the evidence. On one side, you had legal texts, the official orders and decrees from the French administration. The judges decided these were the primary source, the real legal title. And on the other side, you had maps, and the court was super skeptical of the maps, seeing them as often inaccurate, contradictory, and definitely not legally binding on their own.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The court flat out said that a map is not the law. It can be supporting evidence, sure. They can help confirm something you already know from a legal text. But a map by itself can't create a right to territory. It's just a picture of what the law might be, not the law itself.
And then there was this third bucket of evidence, these things called colonial effectivities. It sounds fancy, but it just means the facts on the ground. It's about what the colonial officials were actually doing back in the day. Which administration was collecting taxes from a particular village? Who was in charge of maintaining a certain road? These real-world actions could give powerful clues as to how everyone understood the border in practice.
All right, so we've got the guiding principle, and we've got the different types of evidence. Now for the fun part. Let's see how the court actually put all these pieces together to finally draw a concrete line on the map. This is where the legal detective work really shines.
Let's start with a really clear example from the judgment. A disputed area in the West that became known as the sector of the Four Villages. This part of the case is a perfect illustration of how the court put legal texts first.
The court's logic here was just so methodical. First, they found the smoking gun,
a 1935 administrative order. The text was very specific, saying the boundary was leaving these 4 villages to the district of Mopti, which is now in Mali. The key move was how they interpreted that. They decided the order wasn't creating a new line, it was simply declaring the line as it already existed back in 1932. And from there, the conclusion was simple. The border must run south of the villages, putting them firmly in Mali. Case closed.
But, okay, that was a case with a clear paper trail. What about areas where the documents were fuzzy or didn't exist at all? Well, let's look at another spot on the border, a really important water source called the Pool of Soum. Here, the court had to get a bit more creative.
Because for the Soum region, this was exactly the problem. The legal texts were silent. The maps all showed different things. The trail went cold. When you have no clear colonial-era guideposts, what is a court supposed to do? They started looking at other clues, even things that happened after independence, and they found this little gem, a record of a local meeting in 1965, where officials from both Mali and the former Upper Volta got together and called Sukhom a frontier pool. Now, this wasn't a formal treaty, but it was a massive clue. It showed a shared understanding on the ground that the pool belonged to both of them.
So, with no other guide, the court turned to a different tool in its toolbox. It's a principle called equity infra legem, which basically means applying fairness, but within the existing framework of the law. Since the evidence suggested both sides treated the pool as shared, the fairest, most equitable solution was obvious. Just divide it right down the middle.
So after painstakingly weighing all this evidence, the texts, the maps, the facts on the ground, section by section, the court finally delivered its verdict. But the decision was about so much more than just this one line. It was a powerful statement about the enduring legacy of colonial borders in modern Africa.
So to sum it all up, the final verdict was this careful patchwork, built from the best evidence they could find for each individual sector. The 4 villages went to Mali, based on that key legal text. The Pool of Soum was split 50-50, based on equity. And further east, the court followed a line along the high ground, the watershed, because that's what another colonial document described.
And this all comes back to the incredible power of that ut possidetis principle. Yes, it means you're locking in borders that can seem totally arbitrary, lines drawn on a map in Europe with zero regard for the people living there. But the alternative, reopening every single border for debate, well, that's seen as a much, much greater threat to peace and stability across the entire continent.
And you don't have to take my word for it. As the court itself so powerfully put it, maintaining the existing borders is often the wisest course. It's about preserving what the people of Africa achieved through their long and difficult struggles for independence. It is, at its core, a pragmatic choice for peace.
Which leaves us with this final big question. The case of the Ghost Border shows us in vivid detail that lines drawn a century ago by colonial powers are still shaping the world today. It's a powerful reminder of just how deeply history is woven into our present, and it makes you wonder, when nations inherit their very boundaries from the past, how do they chart a course toward a future that is truly their own?